Hi, and welcome to the third episode of the Impressions podcast. Today we're going to be talking about the very famous To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. I got right here the Warner Books paperback edition. Real cheap, but it does the job real well. Got nice, fancy, cursive-ish italic font on the cover. Kind of hokey drawing on the front, but all in all, this is a nice package for not very much money. So, I mean, that's the beauty of these classics, right? You can always find a version of them for a reasonable amount of money. So, To Kill a Mockingbird, its reputation precedes it, a bit like last week with The Great Gatsby. So I had seen, I believe, the movie before reading this, so I knew the general outlines of the story, but that was a long time ago, so there was a lot that were there were a lot of surprises in it. So, To Kill a Mockingbird is in two parts, very loosely. One part happens when the main character, I believe, is 6 years old, the main character being Scout, who's the daughter of Atticus Finch, a lawyer in Alabama in the 1930s, I think, is when this takes place. And then the second half of the story, in the second half of the story, it jumps about 2 or 3 years later, I believe, and that's when the trial happens. That's the sort of big central conflict in the story. So, in general, this is a classic for a reason. It's very much in the style of... So, I mean, this was written in 1960, which is much later than I thought, and it makes sense when I read it, because there's something very kind of plain and unpretentious about the writing, which can itself be somewhat annoying at times. It feels just a tad... Like, The Great Gatsby is very much a modernist novel, as was El Señor Presidente. This is... I mean, it's modernist in some sense, but it's not particularly imagistic. It's not particularly sort of aggressively poetic, I'd say. It's much more plain-spoken in the, good old American tradition. And I think there is something about it that does feel kind of contemporary, where it kind of lacks the mystique, maybe, of these older books. But I don't think that's too much of a problem. Now, part one, part two, a lot of famous scenes. There are two I really want to focus on, because I think the strength of To Kill a Mockingbird, because it is so much of... I mean, it's not an episodic story, but it kind of is. There are lots of... It just kind of slowly unfolds. It's not like one coherent, tight, like, single plot. It's a little more languid than that. So, I think I'm going to talk about two scenes in particular, or subplots. One being in the first part, one being in the second part. And I tried to pick two that were maybe not... So I'm not going to talk about the trial, because I'm sure that's been talked about by everybody and her brother. But let's talk about part one. So, very end of part one. So throughout part one, we've got Jem, who's the brother of our main character, Scout. He's a few years older, and both of them are somewhat troublemakers, but they're also kind of, dream children, right? I mean, they're somewhat responsible. They like to read. They very much love their father. I mean, I think that the book understands that these children are good ones, so to speak. But Jem and Scout, for that matter, they both have a bit of a righteous temper, so they get themselves into trouble with it. And so, at some point, right towards the end of part one, we learn that Atticus is going to defend Tom Robinson, which he does in part two. And, yeah, so we learn that he's going to defend Tom Robinson. And because of this society that this is set in, obviously rural Alabama in the 1930s, there are implications to this. And that one of the implications is that Atticus, by, as the book describes, doing a job nobody else in Maycomb wants to do, brings a lot of opprobrium on himself and on his children. And so one of the people who provides this opprobrium is Mrs. Dubose, who sits out on her porch and heckles, I guess you could say, the children as they walk by for school. And at one point, Jem gets right upset and cuts down her hedges, or something along these lines. And so that gets him into trouble. And as punishment, in addition to, tending the hedges and helping them return to health, he also is asked by Mrs. Dubose to read to her, I think Ivanhoe. But in any case, what's important is we slowly kind of get the impression that Mrs. Dubose is not in good health. I mean, okay, it's explained that way, but we start to sort of understand the severity of it. And she dies sort of off screen, so to speak, off the page, and the characters learn about it. And Atticus starts explaining more about her situation. And I'm just going to read an entire maybe page and a half. So let's start. I'm going to start on page 111 of this paperback, and I'm going to read just about to the end of part 2, to the start of part 2, rather. Mrs. Dubose was a morphine addict, says Atticus. She took it as a painkiller for years. The doctor put her on it. She'd have spent the rest of her life on it and died without so much agony, but she was too contrary. Sir, said Jem. Atticus said, just before your escapade, she called me to make her will. Dr. Reynolds told her she had only a few months left. Her business affairs were in perfect order, but she said, there's still one thing out of order. What was that? Jem was perplexed. She said she was going to leave this world beholden to nothing and nobody. Jem, when you're sick as she was, it's all right to take anything to make it easier, but it wasn't all right for her. She said she made to break herself of it before she died, and that's what she did. Jem said, you mean that's what her fits were? Yes, that's what her fits were. That's what they were. Most of the time you were reading to her, I doubt if she heard a word you said. Her whole mind and body were concentrated on that alarm clock. If you hadn't fallen into her hands, I'd have made you go read to her anyway. It may have been some distraction. There was another reason. Did she die free? Asked Jem. As the mountain air, said Atticus. She was conscious to the last, almost. Conscious, he smiled, and cantankerous. She still disapproved heartily of my doings, and said I'd probably spend the rest of my life bailing you out of jail. She had Jessie fit you this box. Atticus reached down and picked up the candy box. He handed it to Jem. Jem opened the box. Inside, surrounded by wads of damp cotton, was a white, waxy, perfect camellia. It was a snow on the mountain. Jem's eyes nearly popped out of his head. Old hell devil, he screamed, flinging it down. Why can't she leave me alone? In a flash, Atticus was up and standing over him. Jem buried his face in Atticus's shirt front. Shh, he said. I think that was her way of telling you. Everything's all right now, Jem. Everything's all right. You know, she was a great lady. A lady? Jem raised his head. His face was scarlet. After all those things she said about you, a lady? She was. She had her own views about things. A lot different than mine, maybe. Son, I told you that if you hadn't lost your head, I'd have made you go read to her. I wanted you to see something about her. I wanted you to see what real courage is, instead of getting the idea that courage is a man with a gun in his hand. It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. You rarely win, but sometimes you do. Mrs. Dubose won, all 98 pounds of her. According to her views, she died beholden to nothing and nobody. And with that, part 1 ends. Obviously, this is to some extent the thesis of the book, right? The idea, this central idea about courage. I think the Dubose episode is an important precursor to the trial, and I think it's honestly just as powerful as the trial in a different sort of way. I think, though, where this episode particularly works is that I think the real clever choice of Harper Lee, the absolutely essential choice, is the choice to have children. So obviously Scout's the narrator, but Jem is also a central character, and Atticus is viewed solely through the lens of being a father who's sort of teaching them how to act and how to behave. And through this, in the trial, for instance, and I'll get to this, so I'll get to the other way in which Harper Lee uses this perspective to a clever thematic effect. But in the first part, she uses this to the effect of the sort of classic scenario of characters believing the worst about somebody, viewing them as petty and shallow and mean and vindictive. And then, by learning more information about her, starting to understand where she's coming from and understand the bravery that she's demonstrated and the courage that she's demonstrated. So this is one method of learning. It's the learning by the addition of new information, and it's a sort of expansion of the mind, seeing the best in other people and learning more about their circumstance. The second part very much continues this trend, and there are many situations which I could use this to discuss, particularly sort of lessons Atticus gives. But I think that the second part, the strongest passage, or at least the one that stuck with me the most, aside from maybe the trial, was the scene outside the jail. Now, to get to the second thematic method of establishing theme, rather, I think it's useful to... Here we go. Yeah, so if I read the back of this book, this is the pitch that Warner Books gives. Compassionate, dramatic, and deeply moving, To Kill a Mockingbird takes readers to the roots of human behavior, to innocence and experience. And it goes on. But I think that that's the idea. The loss of innocence that comes with growing up. And in this case, I think it's particularly stark. So I'm just going to read this passage cold, and then I'll talk about it. Here we go. So at this point, this is in part 2, right? So Tom Robinson has been transferred to the jail in Maycomb, and Atticus has gone out at night for some reason. The children aren't sure why. But at some point, Jem gets up a hunch that he ought to go visit his father. So I'm going to talk about how that unfolds. "Come on," whispered Jem. We streaked across the square, across the street, until we were in the shelter of the jitney jungle door. Jem peeked up the sidewalk. "We can get closer," he said. We ran to Tyndall's hardware door, near enough, at the same time discreet. In ones and twos, men got out of the cars. Shadows became substance as lights revealed solid shapes moving toward the jail door. Atticus remained where he was. The men hid him from view. "He in there, Mr. Finch?" a man said. "He is," we heard Atticus answer. "And he's asleep. Don't wake him up." In obedience to my father, there followed what I later realized was a sickeningly comic aspect of an unfunny situation. The men talked in near whispers. "You know what we want," another man said. "Get aside from the door, Mr. Finch." "You can turn around and go home again, Walter," Atticus said pleasantly. "Heck Tate's around somewhere." "Hell he is," said another man. "Heck's bunch is so deep in the woods they won't get out till morning." "Indeed? Why so?" "Called him off on a snipe hunt," was the succinct answer. "Didn't you think of that, Mr. Finch?" "Thought about it, but didn't believe it." "Well then." My father's voice was still the same. "That changes things, doesn't it?" "It do," another deep voice said. Its owner was a shadow. Do you really think so? This was the second time I heard Atticus ask that question in 2 days, and it meant somebody's man would get jumped. This was too good to miss. I broke away from Jem and ran as fast as I could to Atticus. Jem shrieked and tried to catch me, but I had a lead on him and Dill. I pushed my way through the dark, smelly bodies and burst into the circle of light. "Hey, Atticus!" I thought he would have a fine surprise, but his face killed my joy. A flash of plain fear was going out of his eyes, but returned when Dill and Jem wriggled into the light. There was a smell of stale whiskey and pigpen about, and when I glanced around, I discovered that these men were strangers. They were not the people I saw last night. Hot embarrassment shot through me. I had leaped triumphantly into a ring of people I had never seen before. Atticus got up from his chair, but he was moving slowly, like an old man. He put the newspaper down very carefully, adjusting its creases with lingering fingers. They were trembling a little. "Go home, Jem," he said. "Take Scout and Dill home." We were accustomed to prompt, if not always cheerful acquiescence to Atticus's instructions, but from the way he stood, Jem was not thinking of budging. "Go home," I said. Jem shook his head. As Atticus's fists went to his hips, so did Jem, and as they faced each other, I could see little resemblance between them. Jem's soft brown hair and eyes, his oval face, and snug-fitting ears were our mother's, contrasting oddly with Atticus's graying black hair and square-cut features, but they were somehow alike. Mutual defiance made them alike. "Son," I said, "go home." Jem shook his head. "I'll send him home," a burly man said, and grabbed Jem roughly by the collar. He yanked Jem nearly off of his feet. "Don't you touch him." I kicked the man swiftly. Barefooted, I was surprised to see him fall back in real pain. I intended to kick his shin, but aimed too high. "That'll do, Scout." Atticus put his hand on my shoulder. "Don't kick folks." "No," he said as I was pleading justification. "Ain't nobody gonna do Jem that way," I said. "All right, Mr. Finch, get him out of here," someone growled. "You got 15 seconds to get him out of here." In the midst of this strange assembly, Atticus stood, trying to make Jem mind him. "I ain't going," was his steady answer to Atticus's threats, requests, and finally, "Please, Jem, take them home." I was getting a bit tired of that, but felt Jem had his own reasons for doing as he did, in view of the prospects when Atticus did get him home. I looked around the crowd. It was on a summer's night, but the men were dressed, most of them, in overalls and denim shirts buttoned up to the collars. I thought they must be cold-natured, as their sleeves were unrolled and buttoned at the cuffs. Some wore hats pulled firmly down over their ears. They were sullen-looking, sleepy-eyed men who seemed unused to late hours. I sought once more for a familiar face, and at the center of the semicircle I found one. "Hey, Mr. Cunningham." The man did not hear me, it seemed. "Hey, Mr. Cunningham, how's your entailment getting along?" So, as it goes on, Scout begins to talk to Mr. Cunningham, and he eventually returns the conversation, and eventually this sort of moment of humanity convinces him to leave. Now, of course, what these men are attempting is a lynching, and we get that with the terribly cold line on page 151. I mean, I struggled to read this properly because you know exactly how it's supposed to sound when you read it in the book. But that line, "you know what we want." Because it isn't so pretentious. It's almost offhand. It's just so matter-of-fact, so it's a way of saying something terrible and awful as though it's completely matter of course. And I think that highlights, I think that single moment, just as much as the trial, highlights the entire sort of important heart of this entire book, which is that these people, throughout prejudice and throughout close-mindedness, they take as matter of fact things that are plainly wrong. They convince themselves of things that are obviously false. As we see in the trial, right? They convince themselves that a man is guilty who just obviously isn't. And I think that while the trial is a great example of a loss of innocence, I think that much more subtly this passage is. And I think the reason why is because the moment that the reader sees "you know what we want" on the page, you know what Harper Lee is talking about. But Scout does not. And Scout demonstrates an innocence throughout the entire scene, right? She diffuses the entire scene by talking to Mr. Cunningham as though they're just having a conversation. Throughout this entire section, she does not realize what's going on. Of course, throughout the rest of the book, this innocence and naivete will be disabused, and Scout will grow progressively more realistic. Jem will grow increasingly more cynical, but Scout will grow more realistic, and she'll kind of adjust to this striking realization. But I think this, at the very start of part 2, I think this demonstrates the place of innocence that a child operates from, where they cannot believe that, as these men are about to do, that they're assembling to lynch a man. And to a child, they can't understand how that's a matter of course. So, To Kill a Mockingbird, I think it's not always the tightest plotted book. I think the Boo Radley stuff, I'm still not totally sold on the Boo Radley subplot. There's something about it that just doesn't quite work for me. I'm not sure what. And I think that I know that the I know that the Yules, right? They're a type, but I'm not sure that I feel like they're used as an example for this trial of someone who's just so obviously not a not good group of people for the most part. And I think the book is very strong when it shows some compassion for the situation of the daughter, Mayabella. However, I think that the father figure of the Yules is too obvious of a villain. I think that the implausibility of the case, while it serves the point, also maybe it's a bit too heavy-handed at times. And I think the Yules, right? For example, the Yule patriarch trying to kill children at the end of the book, it feels a little out of place. The rest of the story seems to demonstrate how clearly wrong actions are commonplace. But this action is clearly wrong, and it's definitely not commonplace. I don't care where you are, just willy-nilly killing children walking home from a Halloween party is not, normal behavior. So I think that kind of... I'm not sure that really works in this book. But, okay, I think there are some strong points, and I think those scenes in particular really stick out to me. So, To Kill a Mockingbird, overall impression, it's maybe not as clear a classic as I was thinking, in terms of the fact that the style is quite plain at times. It's not particularly interested in being it's not particularly expressionistic or imagistic. But to be fair, it's very difficult to write a really strong book that distinguishes itself in this sort of plain language. And this book does distinguish itself. Atticus Finch is one of the great characters. I mean, right, that line, I'll go back to that same line at the end of part 1, again and again and again and again and again. It's such a good line. I wanted you to see what real courage is, ... It's when you know you're licked before you begin, but you begin anyway, and you see it through no matter what. I mean, that's one of the great lines in all of literature. And so overall, I think To Kill a Mockingbird is clearly recommendable. And this is a really good book. I would highly recommend reading this book. So with that, I think I'm going to take a break, and I'll get back to you with the other odds and ends on the second half of this podcast. Welcome to the second half of this podcast. That, of course, was the start of the only piano sonata written by Leoš Janáček. Now, this is a fitting piece of music. It has a program, as so much of Janáček did, and in this case, the program, it's called In the Street, and it's named after a killing of I believe a student protester in the streets of Czechia, right, which at that point was a province of Austria-Hungary, and I believe that was in 1905. So, Janáček, okay, I don't know how much the listener knows about Czech music, but I think if you look at Czech classical music, it's always sort of a reaction to Austria-Hungary. And in fact, I think it's probably the clearest reaction to Austria-Hungary, because it's very clearly this sort of place outside of the metropole that's been sort of occupied by this sort of imperial force. And so you get a lot of emphasis on folk melody as sort of a act of resistance. So the famous composer of this is Bedřich Smetana. Particularly, he wrote a lot of tone poems, he wrote the operas, very much in the sort of Lisztian mode, but much more folk-influenced. Everything is very clear-cut. He's a big fan of, like, 2/4, for instance. Lots and lots of dances in 2/4, polkas, that sort of thing. And the most famous composer, I mean, just more broadly outside of, their influence on Czech culture, is Antonín Dvořák, who's very much the staid kind of Brahmsian, kind of the traditional. He's the one who really justifies Czech music to the world. He's the one who proves that, the Czechs can be as, formally and technically gifted as the Germans, for instance. Then after that, things get a little strange in Czech music. I think the big sort of 20th century Czech composer is probably Bohuslav Martinu, but he's much later, and he's kind of out there. He's a bit in the sort of Ravel style. He has a very weird, idiosyncratic style. But I think the composer who really who fills that modernist gap and bridges from, the heady romanticism of Dvořák and the kind of eclectic stuff of Martinu has got to be Leoš Janáček. So this is his piano sonata that I listened to and I'm going to be talking about today. But Leoš Janáček is probably most famous for, lots of people know the Sinfonietta, but the two pieces I knew him from before this, although he wrote a lot of good piano music too, but the two pieces that I know him best from are the two string quartets. And those are, standards of the string quartet repertoire. Probably, I would go so far as to say, well, the Czechs have a lot of good string quartets. I don't know if they're the pinnacle of the Czech string quartet tradition, because, you have Smetana and, the late Dvořák quartets. But anyway, this quartet is still quite good. His quartets are still quite good, that is. This piano sonata is in a very similar mold to the first string quartet. So the first string quartet is the one that's called the Kreutzer Sonata, and that's the old joke, right? Because Beethoven wrote his Kreutzer Sonata, then Tolstoy wrote a short story based on the Kreutzer Sonata that he called Kreutzer Sonata, and then Janáček wrote a string quartet based on the short story by Tolstoy. So it's like 3 steps, and all of them are called Kreutzer Sonata. But that one, I think, it's very motivic in the same way that a lot of German music is. So there are these repeated patterns, motifs that show up everywhere. But I think more than that, it's really kind of like cellular, because it's obsessive in the main ideas that it returns to. And this piano sonata in the street is very, very similar. So the main idea, which you may have heard at the end of that transitionary bit I was playing, which is actually the start of the entire piano sonata, goes like this. Sorry. And that motif shows up over and over and over and over and over again. Just at a guess, probably like 200, 300 times in just the first 6 minutes of music. It's absolutely obsessive. And it unifies the entire first section, and it unifies the entire piano sonata just by sort of sheer force of will. It's that compelling. And I think that in the context of this, right, where we're talking about a death, the first movement, so the second movement is the one called Death. The first one is called, the score that I'm looking at is a copy I got, it's public domain off of museopen.org. It says The Presentiment. That seems like kind of I don't love that title. I think that it's more like the prophecy, I think, is probably a better translation, where this is where we, deep down, we know what's coming. Just as in, To Kill a Mockingbird, when that trial starts, we know what's coming. At least, I had already seen the movie, so I definitely knew what was coming. But, if you pick up on the clues Harper Lee is giving, you know what's coming. And I think that this sort of prophecy movement, by having that same idea over and over and over again, obsessive, never relenting, where you just can't look away, is a really great musical image of that sort of having something right there that you really don't want to see, but you cannot hide. So that's Janáček Piano Sonata, really a good piece of music. If you want, modernist piano sonatas, this is about as good as they get. So really good stuff. And I think it's right, along with the other great Czech sonatas, the great, Czech string quartets, the late Dvorak symphonies. I think this is right in the pantheon alongside them. It's a good piece of music. So that's Janáček. Next, I'd like to talk about more piano music, this time from the composer from France, Gabriel Fauré. Gabriel Fauré is an interesting composer. He's also the sort of transitionary figure between Romanticism and modernism, so he wrote around the same time as Janáček, between 1875 and 1921, I believe. And Janáček, Fauré, really big fan of piano music. That was sort of when he was most comfortable. He also wrote a lot of sonatas for strings and piano, so, violin sonatas, piano quintets, this sort of thing. And Fauré's style is very interesting. He's kind of this combination of two very, very distinct, moods. So the first is very much like his teacher, at one point, I believe, Camille Saint-Saëns, who has this sort of neoclassical simplicity about him, where it's something to the effect of just a good, clean melody, good, clean accompaniment, executed very, very well. It's very, very professional, very, very polished. Everything is in its correct place. And because of this, there is a sort of nobility, a sort of dignity in that simplicity. So he's got that sort of Saint-Saëns aspect to him, but then he's also got this sort of strange, ineffable kind of striving for something that's indescribable, and which the music, while it tries to capture, can't really capture. So I think he shares this sort of, musical mysticism with someone like Scriabin, or, there are a bunch of sort of German composers in this sort of style, sort of Central European composers, someone like Zemlinsky comes to mind, where it's just kind of tough music to get. And so Fauré, it's a very interesting combination, this incredible simplicity, and yet at the same time, it's still difficult to grasp. So he wrote four main, there's more piano music he wrote, but the four main sort of collections I listened to are, first there are the Impromptus and the Valse-Caprices, or, flighty waltzes, I guess is what you'd say in English. Flighty waltzes are not really Fauré's strong suit, I don't think, because they lack the sort of ineffable quality that I think distinguishes him. So they're listenable. I'd place them in a similar sort of piece, or sort of selection of Valse-Caprices is like Chaminade. So the kind of French salon music. But Fauré lives up to, I think, Chaminade's Valse-Caprices. So, they're listenable. Then the Impromptus, they're interesting. I think I struggle with Impromptus written after, say, 1850, because there is something... I think there's something about the more abstract style that makes it harder to grasp if there isn't a sort of clear structure. And I think that in the Impromptus, the lack of the clear structure is kind of disorienting. So obviously, the great Impromptuists, if that's a word, are probably Schubert and Chopin. But after that, I'm still not sold. For example, Scriabin, I liked his preludes more than I liked his Impromptus, and I feel, again, like the Impromptus aren't really Fauré's strong suit. I feel like don't get me wrong, again, the Impromptus and Valse-Caprices are still interesting, but I think that the two genres where Fauré was most comfortable are the Nocturnes and the Barcarolles. And I believe Fauré famously said something to the effect of, I just named them these things because my publishers, asked me to. But the actual distinction between what's a nocturne and a barcarolle is, meaningless. So I'm going to play a bit from two of the nocturnes. It so happens that the two pieces that stuck with me the most were entitled Nocturne. The first is the Opus 33 No. 1, which was written very, very early on, I think around 1875, actually. And the second was from his middle to late period, all the way in 1913, and that's the Opus 104 No. 1 Nocturne. So I'm going to start with the Opus 33 No. 1, and perhaps you can see a little bit of Fauré's style. So this is the opening 2 and a bit bars. Also in E-flat minor, just like the Janáček. So that's the opening melody from the very first nocturne of Fauré, and you'll notice it's just chords in the left hand, and the right hand you've got this very, very simple melody. So the melody is literally just... obviously different rhythm, but so you have this... which is, it's literally just a 5-1, that progression in E-flat minor. Obviously, there are different chords that are playing that are not the 5, and those are really... I really would encourage you to look, if you're into music theory, to look at the first couple of bars, because it's not that complicated of a chord progression, but it's really, really effective. And obviously, the trick he uses, right, is whenever you want to stay on a chord, you simply you move it up a third, or so on, right? You just use a different inversion. So with E flat minor, for instance, you can play... right, and I only played E flat minor chords there, but you get a different flavor. But then what's really interesting about Fauré is that in this style of... right, so why was Chanson such an effective composer? Because of his structure. That's why he's famous, because, lots of people can write, polished music and professional music. But what Chanson was really good at was providing a structure for it to live in. And Fauré is also quite an interesting structuralist. So he has this habit of... his nocturnes are quite long. They're 6 minutes probably on average, something like that. So obviously Chopin, you're talking 2 or 3 minutes for most of them. So double the length of a Chopin nocturne. And the way Fauré accomplishes this, he does a lot of ternary form and things of this sort, but he really, really likes these sort of 1-minute blocks. So if you think of Scriabin, right? Scriabin wrote all of these preludes that are a minute long. And Fauré writes in that same sort of mold, but then he concatenates a bunch of different sections together with, recapitulations of prior sections, things like this, to create these longer, sort of more substantial pieces of music. So I'm going to play a little bit from... so literally, for example, at the end of the first page, even though it doesn't even change key, there is a hard bar line. And then you move to the next page, and the next page, even though it hasn't even changed key, it's still... it's clear that this is something different. So I'm going to play the motif that shows up over and over again. So we're still in E flat. And I'm going to play... there's this weird kind of crawling, creeping motif that goes to the effect of... and so on and so forth. And on top of that, he plays this melody that is almost identical to the second movement of Beethoven's First String Quartet. Fauré's very early style, and it's not necessarily representative of his later style, because that's all the sort of Saint-Saëns clear line stuff. And this other nocturne I'm going to play a little bit from, just again the first couple of bars, and I'm going to butcher the accompaniment, because I'm not a very good pianist, but this is the sort of main thrust. This is in F-sharp minor. So now we've got to read sharps instead of flats. And the very opening, this is only in 3/4. So Fauré likes his triple meters. So Opus 33 number 1 is also in 3/4. And this is how this is the 11th of the Nocturnes, the Opus 104 number 1. Now think about where this is going to resolve. This is where it resolves to. So this is already quite odd. This is not as straightforward. The distinction between accompaniment and melody is not very large, and the harmony is very weird. So I'm still not sure if I've completely gotten Leoš Fauré. I'm going to listen to more of it, and maybe I'll come back with it in a later podcast. But for now, I think the important thing to know about Fauré is he wrote a lot of piano music, and if you're into turn-of-the-century French piano music, you should give it a try. Now, speaking of French turn-of-the-century piano music, this is not actually piano music, this is a little more involved. This is the Chanson perpétuelle by Ernest Chausson, which is very much in the sort of Wagner, Liebestod mold, but I really like the arrangement that he made. This was right towards the end of his life. Chausson was same time as Fauré, right? He was also a French composer, but he was kind of the bridge between like César Franck and Claude Debussy. And so he had a very, very florid sort of style, very evocative, poetic. I think somebody wrote something to the effect of, if Marcel Proust had written music, he would sound like Ernest Chausson, and I think that's right. So what I like about this one in particular, and I highly encourage anybody who's interested in this piece of music to listen to this specific arrangement, which is the arrangement for piano, quintet, and singer. So this is a song, cantata thing. I mean, it's a long song, very short cantata. Right, chanson perpétuelle, song, right? But it's really up to the listener to kind of categorize it. A lot of songs like that, like what's the poem? Is it a concerto? Is it a fantasy? And, the poem de l'amour et de la mer. There's lots of Chausson that works like this. But the Chanson perpétuelle is really, really interesting because you have this, right? Chausson also wrote the concert, which is the same group of instruments, but with a violin instead of a singer. And for sort of one of his last works, he instead replaces the violin from the violin, string quartet, and piano into, it transforms it into a voice. So it's voice, string quartet, and piano. And it's a really, really interesting piece of music. Really fun, creepy, which is interesting, but it's a very creepy piece of music at times. It's, the classic, lover who's going to kill herself because her love left, that sort of thing. But I think it transcends the lyrics, which, to be fair, start really, really brilliant. I mean, the first line is something to the effect of, let's see, so it's bois frissonnant, ciel étoilé, mon bien-aimé, son étalé. So that pronunciation is going to be a bit dubious. The idea is, right, shivering woods, starry sky, my love has left me. So she's addressing, but shivering woods, what a line. And when that comes in, that melody, it's brilliant. But just like in a lot of the music that he wrote, there are these sort of portentous cyclical themes. And in this case, the piece of music does not start with singing. It starts instead with this little piano line that goes something to the effect of, I'm going to play kind of a simplified version of it, but you'll get the gist. But this is how it starts. Later, it finally resolves to this. We finally resolve back to C sharp minor, and this is how the singing begins. So I'll play the voice part, the vocal part, in my right hand. that's quite plaintive, isn't it? Really remarkable piece of music. I really like Chausson, and I hadn't heard this piece really ever before, the past couple of weeks. So I was really excited to come across it, and I think it's really something special. So I've got more that I'll talk about next week, but I think that's going to sum up this edition of the Impressions podcast. So remember, to start with, we've got To Kill a Mockingbird, written in 2 parts by Harper Lee, which is quite an effective piece of writing. It's simple, it's straightforward, so it's not a particularly expressionistic novel, but in that quiet simplicity is a lot of ability. Then we've also got 3 pieces of music. So we've got the Janáček piano sonata entitled In the Street, particularly the opening movement, The Prophecy. I think Janáček's a really interesting composer. He's this very kind of obsessive composer. And the piano sonata is a really great entry point into that. Then we've got the piano music of Fauré, which I found somewhat inaccessible, which I suppose shouldn't surprise me, because there is something a kind of ineffable about Fauré's music. But I did like the Nocturnes, and I think those in particular, which were Opus 33 number 1 and Opus 104 number 1, were 2 standouts. And then finally we have the Chanson perpétuelle. I like the recording by the Emerson String Quartet on their last album ever before they disbanded. I thought that was a really, really wonderful recording with the string quartet and piano, both accompanying the soloist. So that'll do it for today. I'll see you next week.